morning and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jim Doolittle, Director of the South Carolina SCRA program and your moderator for today. Do note that we are recording the webinar today. A link to access the webinar will be sent to all registrants later today for you to access the webinar. As the webinar is going on, if you have questions, please be sure and use the Q&A chat button at the bottom of your interface and enter those questions there, and we'll address them either while the presentation is going on or at the end. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Christopher Cecil. Christopher is the founder and creative director of SLANT. SLANT is a creative marketing and design agency in South Carolina that has offices in both Charleston and Greenville. Christopher has received national recognition for his creative works, receiving a Gold Addy Award for interactive design and a Silver Addy for logo design. I want to thank Christopher for joining us today and talking to us about the user experience and user interface. I'm looking forward to your presentation, Christopher, and learning more about these two issues as we're trying to promote various things in our organization. So, Christopher.
All right, thank you, Jim, for that introduction. Thanks everybody for joining today. As Jim has pointed out, we're going to talk about UX and UI. So let me get my screen share going here, and hopefully everybody can see my screen there. All right, so let's jump in. First things first, as mentioned, I'm Christopher Cecil. I'm an upstate native from Spartanburg, South Carolina, and a Clemson graduate. And back in 2004, I started a company called SLANT while I was living in Charleston. And today we're going to give you a crash course on UX and UI and what it all means for business. But first, let me give you a quick introduction as to why SLANT is qualified to talk about this. As Jim mentioned, we're a creative marketing and design agency with an office in Charleston and here in the upstate. We've been doing this for a while, about 16 or just over 16 years now, for a lot of different clients across a lot of different places for a lot of different challenges. We'd like to talk about the services that we cover as a spectrum from creating over to consulting with lots of things happening in the middle. But today we're here to talk about UX and UI. So let's get down to it. I usually like to start this conversation with the most obvious: what the hell is UX and UI? In a nutshell, pretty straightforward. UX, which stands for user experience, is how something should function. On the flip side, UI is identified as the user interface, or more specifically, how something looks. So let me show you an example of the two to kind of put them side by side in the context that almost all of us can understand, which is, I'd say we're all pretty familiar with tablets and phones. So if we use this as the example, the UX of an iPad, the user experience, is a touch screen with gestures. That's how you operate and function within the device. And the user interface of the iPad is the design and contents of the screen and layout. So hopefully that gives a little bit of context as to the differences between UX and UI. It seems easy enough, but why do people get these terms mixed up? And to explain why they're kind of misunderstood and how they interoperate together, let me indulge you in a very quick history lesson, which is, as a basic concept, UX, or user experience, has been around for, pretty much as long as people have been thinking up and building stuff. Because developing a user experience is not necessarily limited to the digital realm. For example, this steering wheel is the UX for how you maneuver a car. This is the user experience for maneuvering a car. You're in the kitchen cooking. The user experience here is you have a handle attached to a pot so you don't burn yourself or make a huge mess. So, until computers came along, the user experience planning always came first. Nobody was going to design a steering wheel and then figure out what what it should control, or no one's going to design a handle and then figure out what to attach to it. You start with the experience planning first. But in the digital realm, the nature of a website or an app or a presentation or any of those sorts of things, the whole nature of that is positioning elements on the screen. So technically, you can end up designing a website or an app or a presentation long before you've decided how it should actually function. So in this situation, the design could end up influencing how the app or the website functions, and that may not necessarily be a good thing. So because of that you can start designing before you've thought it through, a lot of people mistakenly consider UX and UI as the same thing. And it's clearly not, or else it would be called user experience face or something like that. But you also have on the flip side, you've got people who think UX planning is completely unnecessary and all they care about is the user interface. So I'm here to let you know that in reality, they're both necessary. They rely on each other because good UX planning will drive UI decisions, and UI decisions, the way something looks, will also help you improve some of your user experience decisions. And right smack in the middle of that is where you find happy users. So just to give you, to kind of put all that into context, let me give you a couple of examples here. So ever wanted to go to a restaurant where, you're starving and you're ready to make a reservation or put in an order for takeout, and you go to their website and all you want to find is the hours of the phone number. And you go to this website and it's gorgeous and it's got all this cool stuff on it, and you're learning all about all the life story about the chef and what they did as a child, but all you want is the phone number. Just give me the phone number so I can order food. I've been there a few times. I'm sure some of you have as well. This is a perfect example of bad user experience, beautiful user interface. So it looks wonderful, but it's not so easy to use because your audience, you haven't understood what your audience needs out of that. On the flip side, I'm going to pick on my friends at the Pita House here in Greenville. You've got on the flip side something like this, which is only the information you need, the contact information right there. This is a good example of great user experience, but I mean, the user interface could probably use a little bit of work to make it a little bit more delightful to use. So no offense to the guys at Pita House, we do love them. Another good example of this is in the business realm is the virtual meeting space. So prior to the pandemic, the online meeting and video space was pretty crowded and nearly dominated by Skype and GoToMeeting products. So what was it that Zoom did that crushed everybody else? And the answer is really, it was just flat out easier to use. It was a simple download. There were no user accounts required. The controls were easy and minimalist, and people just could use it anywhere from Gen Z all the way up to the older generations who were forced into this world. It was, the virtual conference world. It was easy for everybody to use. And this was not an accident. User experience is literally one of the core focuses of what they do. This quote here, "We have a relentless focus on making the best products with the best user experience." This is from their head of global services. So it's literally one of their core focuses is to make sure that their product is super easy to use, and it's clearly worked well for them. Okay, so how do you get there? Let's talk about what's involved on both sides of the equation. So how do you do good UX planning? How do you plan for a great user experience? UX planning is a much more analytical approach. So when you're trying to determine the best UX approach, you want to consider questions like, it seems kind of obvious, but what's the user trying to achieve? So as an example, if I'm Uber and the ride sharing service, I should be asking the question of, what's the goal of our app? Is it to educate people how the system works? Maybe. Is it to showcase our drivers? Maybe not. But in reality, once people are users, the number one goal of the app is the users just want to book a ride. So you should be thinking about, in that context, I need to plan a user experience where my users can book their ride as quickly as possible. Another question you might be asking early on is, what are the pain points? So if we stick with that Uber example, what part of the booking process is potentially causing frustrations for my customers. Or say you're planning a big sales pitch, and you might be asking, for the audience that I'm pitching to, what is the worst part of this sales process for them? What can I do to make this easier for them so that I can win this sale? Something along those lines. And then you also probably need to be asking, is there a simpler approach to how you originally thought you should do this? So again, I'll stick with Uber throughout this one. Are there ways of reducing the amount of steps it takes to book a ride on their platform? So if initially I need 5 different things to happen, I want to start thinking through which parts of those processes can I automate, or maybe can I skip and do later so that it's faster and easier for the user. Or going back to that sales pitch example, if the part of the sales process is just most of your audience just gets really tired 10 minutes in, well, what can I do to reduce my sales pitch down to 5 minutes or 10 minutes so I can facilitate conversation faster, as an example. And then lastly, kind of obvious, but still need to answer the question of, is the solution you're working with actually solving the problem? Is the new experience going to solve the problem of booking a car in the simplest way for Uber? If we keep up with that example. So some of these may seem pretty obvious, but a lot of times you would be very surprised how many people don't think about these things first. And depending on the kind of project you're working on, you may not have answers to any of this stuff yet. So a lot of these questions might lead to gathering input, which is sort of the next step of the process. So getting input can take a bunch of different forms. One of the easiest things to do is intake surveys. Intake surveys can provide pretty valuable insights on what users want and what their pain points are. They're easy to craft and easy to distribute, and they can provide, a wealth of insight. And it doesn't have to be overly formal either. This could be as easy as gleaning some feedback from your colleagues if you're working on internal teams. Just start asking, get the input. Surveys are great for input, but depending on the complexity of your project, sometimes users maybe don't know how to verbalize what they want, or what's frustrating about your experience. I think everybody's familiar with Henry Ford's old statement of, if I asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me they wanted a faster horse. They didn't know that they wanted a car instead. So when you do focus groups, you can start to talk through scenarios and understand what people actually want, even if they're having a hard time verbalizing it. And focus groups, again, these don't have to be these, professionally done, super huge undertakings. They can be very casual, and you can even do a random sampling of the old FFN, Friends and Family Network. Have them use your website and tell them, have them get back to you and give you some inputs on what's working and what's not. Or if you're making an app, what are the pain points? Everybody's going to be inclined to give you some opinion. And of course, there's also analytics. So with websites, especially, obviously, you can take a look at your website analytics and find out what your customers and your audiences are actually doing. They can share a lot of insights about users' want. So if your most popular page or the screen of your app isn't your homepage, then maybe there's something missing on your homepage. So easy example. From all that information, the results of those efforts, you would then move into a process that is called information architecture, which is really just fancy for content planning. And that needs to be a lot more involved than just a content outline. Yes, you can start with an outline of, I know that I need to take care of all these things, but information architecture forces you to actually map out where everything's going to go. You literally take the components that need to be conveyed to a customer or to your audience, and you map them out, how they're all going to be connected to each other. And the benefit of doing this process is that it forces you to think about literally everything. Now, what you're seeing here is highly polished in detail, but that's only because we're huge nerds, and that's kind of things we like to do. But it doesn't really matter if you use software or sticky notes and yarn on a conference room wall. As long as you're taking the time to do the information planning process so that you can rapidly move things around and explore different ways of organizing long before you pick up, a computer or a mouse or anything to start building. And I feel like I should also point out, even though everything's highly digital these days, there's absolutely nothing wrong with sketching. We do this from time to time too. As a high-tech company, you'd be surprised that we still pull out the old trace paper and just sketch some stuff out, pin it up on the wall and talk about it. So that's always something that you can do. And then the last part of this process for us is what we would call wireframing. So this is where you take all of that information. You now have the ideas of, what the pain points are, the core functions, all things you need to do. And before you start designing, the best thing to do is what we call wireframing. And basically this is just low fidelity layouts. You can use all kinds of different tools to do this. You can sketch, you can use PowerPoint, you can use whatever you can get your hands on. But the point here is no design, just placing things where they need to go. So in the case of a website, like here's a big picture here, and here's some text here, and here's a big button to call to action, that sort of thing. The beauty of wireframes is that you don't really get bogged down with design decisions, so that you can rapidly lay things out and decide, you know what, this doesn't work. Let's move this here. Let's move that there. And you're not getting bogged down with spacing and scale and all that sort of stuff. So while there are professional tools that you can use, as I mentioned, PowerPoint's great for this. And there's even iOS apps out there for you iPad users, tablet users, where you can, sort of automate the process. You tell it what you're looking to do and it'll throw up blocks and you can kind of just move them around. So that in a nutshell is the UX planning. If everybody's still awake, we'll walk through the UI planning list. I'll pause here for just 1 second. Jim, if there's any questions, I can answer those. Otherwise, we'll proceed.
I've received no questions yet, so go ahead and proceed.
All right. So that was UX. Let's talk about the other side of it. So this is the UI planning, and how do you plan for a good user interface? So as you probably expected, UI is a much more creative approach. So the kinds of questions you're asking here are going to be a little bit different. So one of the first ones, how will the user find the desired action? So on the flip, on the UX side, it is, what is the core function? Okay, on the design side, how can we help them find that function? So if we go back to the Uber example, how are they going to find the button that actually books my ride? So this is where design cues start to come in. Another question that's critical at this stage is, what is the most critical item on screen at this point? One of the challenges we see a lot when people are planning things internally is that they want all the things on the screen because they're worried that somebody might not know where to find it. And that's tricky because sometimes things do have to be hidden. So what helps is at this stage on the screen, what is the most critical thing to look at on the screen right now? And once you determine what that is, then you can start to figure out how to make everything else sort of disappear or fade away. And then how can we make this information more clear? So if it's a paragraph of text, can it be one sentence? Is there a way to use a different word or whatever to make information more clear, knowing that all of our attention spans have gotten a lot shorter as technology has entered more and more into our lives. So the goal here is let's make sure that we're putting the information and making the information as clear as possible. So next step from there, in a very formal design process, this is where you start getting into the creativity stuff. So this is where you're going to want to start looking at colors. What are the colors that best complement your brand, and what helps communicate intent? Green is good, red is bad, that sort of thing. And what can we do to facilitate legibility? ADA compliance is becoming more and more important. Especially for Google. For those who keep up in that space, know that your search engine rankings are now becoming very dependent on how compliant you are with ADA standards. And so facilitating legibility is a very big deal, and color goes a long way with that. Next up, typography. So making sure that things can be read clearly at big scales and small scales, and does it look good? Is it fun? Is it serious? All of that is determined by your typography and your graphic design. So what graphics do we need to support the things that we're saying? So if I'm taking a user through a multi-step process, say I'm selling something and my checkout process is multiple steps, are there graphics that can support each of those steps to help mentally trigger the user to understand what's happening on this particular step? And making sure that it all ties in with your brand, very important. So after you sort of have all those things figured out, that's when you move into the part that everybody typically wants to jump into at the very beginning. So now we're like, all these steps in, and that's when you do your high fidelity designs. And high fidelity designs are exactly what it sounds like. You take those low fidelity wireframes, and this is where you sweat the small stuff. So this is where you turn those into the full-blown designs. This is where you want to consider all the detail. So the more that you have figured out during this high fidelity design process, the less room there is for error once you start building. So this is the time to figure all that stuff out. So starting with wireframes will greatly improve the efficiency of the high fidelity process. And especially if you start the high fidelity, if you start wireframes digitally, where you use a tool to actually create them, it really speeds up the process because the scale and everything is accurate. If you sketch, if you start with sketches, you can get a general idea, but turning a sketch into an actual high fidelity design can probably take a little bit longer because you may find out that you sketched things out that looked like they were in the right scale, but in reality, they were nowhere near the appropriate scale. So you end up spending a little bit more time, kind of manipulating items to get them to work just right. So while you can certainly use tools at hand like PowerPoint to work up a design, and if you do use PowerPoint to do that, God help you, but it's possible. But this high fidelity design process is much better suited to professional tools like Photoshop or Sketch, things of that nature. So this is where having a professional design team, if you don't have one internally, will be a lifesaver for you. There is one last step in a formal design process that agencies like SLANT tend to do, which is called prototyping. And this is especially helpful for websites and apps because you can look at high fidelity designs on your screen all day long, but it doesn't really address what it feels like to go from point A to point B. So what we can do is use tools out there that will take all of these static screenshots and stitch them together in a way where you can simulate what it feels like to actually click through a website. So it's also a useful tool for helping determine where we can add extra layers of animation or other elements that help add polish, because the ultimate goal is you want to design something that is delightful to use. So we can use prototyping to figure out how information should slide in and out of a screen to help you understand what's happening between multi-step processes, for example. Some of our favorite tools for doing this are InVision and Sketch. Both of these tools allow you to create these prototypes, and what's brilliant about them is that you can share them with clients or other team members, and they can all view it and comment, and it becomes a very collaborative process. So that's UX, or excuse me, so that's the UI planning process in a nutshell. And with that, I feel like you're armed with everything you need to know how to plan and design your next app, your next website, that next killer presentation, whatever you're working on. Following all of these steps will make it the best it could possibly be. So happy to answer any questions. Go back if anybody's still with us. Happy to answer anything.
Very good, Christopher. Yes, we do have questions. The first one is there a method in how mobile sites versus desktop sites are developed? Do developers focus on different aspects when designing these two types of interfaces, or simultaneously?
That is a great question. So there is a method to how mobile sites versus desktop is produced. There's a couple parts to the answer to this. So in years past, in the early days of mobile web, developers actually would build an entirely separate website that was just specific to mobile. And that was a common practice quite a while ago. But nowadays, the way this works is you build websites knowing that mobile is likely the dominant screen. So the best practice is actually to design mobile first. So when you're designing a website, it's easier if you start with the mobile display and consider how you want to display everything there, because that's the hardest. And then you can expand it out to the desktop view. Now, in terms of designing the process and building, we build them in a way that's called, the term is responsive design. And so basically what you do is you build the site, and as you saw in the wireframes, content on a website or an app are basically blocks. You've got image blocks and content blocks and things of that nature. And you have to think about, if it's this way, when it shrinks down, how do I want those objects to stack on top of each other? And modern browsers will do a pretty good job of just stuffing things down where it thinks they should go. But that's not always, doesn't always produce the best results. So that's where a lot of planning comes in, with making sure that you know exactly where your elements want to be once it goes into responsive, so that you can then program into your website exactly how you want things to flow once it gets down to that narrow screen. I feel like I just went all over the place, but hopefully that answered your question.
I believe it did. Honestly, follow up. But one question I have, as others are entering their questions, is as you're doing this user experience and thinking about trying to have as much information as possible, is there a good rule of thumb in terms of how deep you go, in terms you have to scroll to find more information versus adding another page, so you make it obvious you click here to get more on this? And again, this kind of, I think, leads to the initial question, because I think it's different in a mobile app where it's easier to scroll to things versus a desktop where it's easier to click to go to things.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
A great question. And I can go ahead and dispel a myth that is very common, which is, there's this age-old thing that everything has to be visible above the fold, which is an old term from newsprint days, where everything has to be right here because no one's going to scroll. It's just not true. There's been so many studies done. I can probably pull, a half dozen and send out some links that users instinctively begin scrolling. Some almost even scroll when there's not even any indication that there's more to see. Users just instinctively begin scrolling. So we are of the opinion that it is not critical that everything has to happen above the fold, but there is a balance. So while users are certainly willing to scroll, and as you mentioned, Jim, it is easier to scroll on mobile. Your finger's already there, you're already primed to just start going. And of course, with the way scrolling works on mobile, it's easy. You've got the elasticity where you can swipe it and it'll just keep scrolling. But there is a fine balance. We would tend to recommend that you don't want to have more than 2, 3, maybe 4 swipes to get down to, if it's taking you that long to get to the bottom of something. There's 2 ways you can fix that. You can start to think about organizing your content into another page, or make sure you're taking advantage of an omnipresent navigation where, as you're scrolling, the nav stays there, where you can jump to parts of the page. So if I'm scrolling and I can't find what I'm looking for, the omnipresent nav that's right there, I can tap it and look to see what I want and push it, and then it jumps me down to that page.
Very good, thank you. The next question that's come in is, which part of the UX UI planning process is the most challenging or takes the longest to go through?
It is the planning. It's the user experience planning for sure. And the reason why is because it ends up being a lot of questions that no one thought to ask. So I can tell you from our experience of when a client comes to us, for example, of saying, we need a new website. Okay, let's get started. And we start asking a lot of questions during the planning process, a lot of the ones that you saw back on the user experience planning slides. And what happens is 9 times out of 10, the client has not really considered any of those questions. And so it turns into a very deep research and strategy planning process. So that ends up taking the majority of the time. And if you do all of that correctly, the design process is very speedy because you've got all the answers, you've done all the work. Because if you do it the other way around, if you don't do all that planning, the design part will take forever because you'll start designing, you'll spend a ton of time on it, and then you'll realize, oh crap, we forgot about A, B, and C. So now we got to go back and redesign that all over again. So if you do it the right way, UX will take the longest.
Very good. Next question comes in is kind of a corollary in that they're saying we need to refresh a website. What is the best way to judge what is working and what needs updating?
Well, the obvious one is, has anyone told you you need a new website? And if that's the case, it might be time for a new website. The best way to do it, honestly, is to have someone outside your organization take a look at it. And I wouldn't have a web, don't go to a web agency or a creative agency and say, look at it. Just go to someone you trust and have a good look at it. I say that not to go to a web agency because I feel like, any web company is going to say, yeah, you need a new website. Because here's the thing, not everybody's website's garbage. Just because it's 5 years old doesn't mean it's garbage. You might be tired of looking at it, and there might be some usability issues that need updating. But if your website is just there and you feel like you need a new website, then it's probably time for a new website. But that's where it's important to talk through what really needs to be done so that you're not just completely burning it down and starting all over again when you might have a lot of things that work really well that you can keep.
Very good. Thank you. The next question is, do you think, kind of looking for a rule of thumb, it looks like, do you think you have to have a set number of pages? I've heard 3 or 5.
No, I do not think you have to have a set number of pages. In fact, I would argue that it's okay to have dozens and dozens of pages. The trick is to make sure that you are revealing information in a way that prevents it from being overwhelming. And what I mean by that is what's far more important than the number of pages is how simplified your site architecture is, your navigation, your main navigation, for example. If you go to a website and you have 12 different main navigation items and each of those have drop downs, it's a pretty guaranteed you're going to overwhelm the user to not know where they want to go. So it's okay to have dozens and dozens of pages, but during the UX process, you hopefully will have identified these are the core things that we need to present to our audience right away. And if those are the 3, maybe 4 things that need to happen right away, maybe that's what belongs in your top level navigation. But then you may have supporting information that's still really important, still things you want found on Google or that you want your user to understand if they want to learn more. All of those pages can be there, but they don't have to be in your main navigation. So if I've got pages upon pages of a case study or case studies that are relevant to a topic on my homepage, I can link to those case studies from a call to action button on the homepage. And there, I'm only one click away from sharing very, very detailed information. And I haven't had to put it up in the main navigation bar and overwhelm my user.
Sorry, I had trouble with my mic control. Thank you. Nothing has rolled in new on the Q&A, but a question I have is the ability to print what you have in your user experience. Quite often, I know myself personally, I get to the point, well, this is good stuff. I want to read it, but I don't have time now. I'm going to be traveling. I'd like to print it out and absorb it later. But quite often sites, if you go to print, it goes garbly and you're printing 20 pages, which would fit on 2. Am I unique that way, or is that something that should be considered in the user experience?
How about this? I'll say both. So you are unique. I mean, that was obviously a very important thing, probably in the earlier days of the web, where you wanted to make sure when you design and develop a website, you have the ability of instructing the browser how you want something printed out. So it is extra steps involved to design what it looks like when it prints. As you've seen, Jim, when you print on a website that hasn't done that work, the browser is doing its best to try and figure out how to print it all out for you. And sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. But with the proliferation of modern browsers on iOS and Android, where you can save the page to be read offline later, that seems to be the more efficient way to do it, because then you can still read the page, still read the site rather, and the content as intended, and you don't have to be online to do it. So we actually don't see a ton of need for the print styling, although it still is relevant for certain things. So for instance, if you run a store, an online store, you may want to make sure that the styling on your product page, so you've clicked on a product and you're viewing the product, you might want to spend a little bit of time to make sure that that particular product page looks nice when it prints out, or when you have a payment's been confirmed and you've got the confirmation screen and you want to be able to print that receipt, spend a little bit of time to make sure that looks good when you print it out. But print styling has kind of fallen off the radar for a lot of our clients.
Thank you. I think I may have shown my hand in terms of my age, so in my request. I'm not seeing additional questions coming in right now. You may have answered everyone's question. Give it a second here. See anything new? Well, I'm not seeing any new questions rolling in. I definitely want to thank you, Christopher. I found this to be very helpful and very informative. I've learned a lot, and especially I didn't know that we could save pages in a static form so that I could look at them later rather than being frustrated and not being able to print them out. So thank you very much for that. I do want to remind participants that this webinar has been recorded, and you'll be receiving a message with a link so that you can view this webinar again later. There will be a survey that you'll have access to, and we sure appreciate if you would take the time to complete the survey. That provides us good feedback on how we do and what we can do well or better. And also be sure and keep in tune with the SCRA webpage and other notifications that come out about the upcoming other webinars that we have, news and other events that you can get through the SCRA webpage with the news and events tab. With that, thank you very much, Christopher. Really appreciate it. It was very informative. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. See you.